Elvis Presley was one of the most important and influential popular cultural figures of the 20th century. He was also a martial artist. Mark Duffett from the University of Chester is an Elvis Presley expert, and we're going to talk about Elvis and martial arts and popular culture. Mark, how are you doing?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm all right. I'm excited to talk about Elvis. I've got my Elvis t-shirt on.
I
It
saw
says,
that.
it
That's
says
excellent.
Elvis Karate at the bottom. And it was bought. It was designed as a joke. A friend of mine loves Elvis, and we went on holiday together one time. He was reading a book about Elvis, and he just kept laughing and reading stuff out about Elvis. And he found the idea of Elvis doing karate to be hilarious. And that we just it became a theme, and he designed his old T-shirt, Elvis Karate. So, what's the status of martial arts in Elvis's life? Do you know?
Wow, good question. Well, from what I've read, it was second only to music in his life in terms of being a hobby and a pastime. But
Yeah.
there's so much to talk about here in terms of like what level he took it to, and as you said, like introducing this through humour. There's a lot to discuss about humour, I think, as well. So there's,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, I think that. I mean, I it was really my friend reading this book, this biography of Elvis, and you've probably read it. It was a biography compiled through lots of press clippings and news stories, and it was basically just
Okay.
one after the other, and anecdotes and interviews and so on. And it seemed to be like because it came to the public's consciousness through a couple of films in the 60s, and then in his Vegas era when he was using his martial arts as a substitute for dancing, as a kind of, he incorporated some of his moves into his Vegas stage shows, didn't he? And this is when we're talking long tassels and lots of sequins. I mean,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, you would know this more than me, but I'm not even sure if any of those moves are actually karate in the kind of combative, sportive sense. They seem to be quite slightly redesigned, perhaps.
well, some of them. I mean, when I don't know when he started to use them, but if you look at his choreography, it's basic punching and kicking, and
Mm.
then it's obviously there's some jiggling in there as well. That's his own. But I think that if you're a martial artist and you're not a very good dancer, you know, this happens. This is what comes out. But he seemed to deliberately choose it, didn't he, as a
Oh, yeah.
routine?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was he 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 was obviously interested in that. I mean, there's just so much to talk about here because I have read that in some ways he was afraid of the audience, so maybe that was a way to kind of get that fear out.
Okay.
Also, it was a way to control the band, and some of the band actually learned karate,
Okay.
so that they could kind of interact with him. So I think there's a sort of element of kind of acuity there that maybe that as I've been reading up stuff more and more on it, I know Ed Parker, is probably somebody we'll talk about, said that Elvis had chi and he had chi on stage, and that kind of the energy
Yeah.
distribution. To me, that's whether that's true or not, and I don't know how you would measure whether it was true. It's certainly a frame that Elvis was put into through his use of karate
Hmm.
that allowed the power that he had over the audience, the power that he had with the audience to be expressed.
Hmm.
I'm interested in it as an authenticating device, perhaps.
Well, I mean, I guess when someone like Ed Parker's talking about chi or ki in the Japanese term would be ki, but if he's talking about it just one of the translations of chi is presence.
Mm.
People think that it's often a kind of a mystical energy, and sometimes it can be regarded as some kind of life force. But when you talk about life force, you're talking about people who exude that
Mm.
health and that power and that, we call it stage presence sometimes, I guess. And if he's
Well,
got that, which he has, he's got it in bucketfuls, hasn't he? I mean, he's got loads of it. People say it about all sorts of, someone walks in a room and you go, wow, they've got this energy. I think maybe Ed Parker was talking about that kind of thing.
yeah, absolutely. What you're talking about there is aura, or the ability to make people starstruck. And I think that the way that I've investigated that over the years is not necessarily to think of it as something true, but to think of it as something that people buy into and believe. And how do they do that? Well, you know, for me, one of the breakthroughs came when somebody said, well, you're writing all this stuff about Elvis and audiences, you should look at Durkheim's ideas about religion. And what
Okay,
Durkheim basically says about religion is that if a large number of people pay attention to something, that thing becomes a totem. And once it becomes a totem, it kind of has a power of its own. People pay more attention to it.
yeah,
And I think, you know, like that for Durkheim, that doesn't have to be a religious thing. It could be a secular thing. I mean, he even talks about like the flag during the French Revolution as kind of having this kind of power. I think like that helped me make sense of Elvis in terms of why does this guy have this immense power in relation to his audience? Now, there's obviously all sorts of reasons for that and frames you can put on it. But evidently he had that, you know, and as you say, there were very rare occasions where I think he lost it.
yeah.
You know, looking at some of the much kind of later, the end of his life when he was on stage, really off out of it on pills and stuff.
Yeah.
You could almost tell he was alone from.
Well, I think if we're talking about presence, stage presence, physical presence, I think that I agree with that entirely. But then, I mean, there's a conversation we need to have about what happens to Elvis when his physical presence or his image or his persona diminishes, and what happens to the imagery surrounding him? Because I kind of think that he did have this sort of magnificence as a performer, but then the further away you get from that, the more funny he becomes. When you think about, you know, when you see someone being amazing, like if you see Bruce Lee or you see Elvis Presley, and they're amazing, but then when you start to do your interpretation of them, or whatever, then it's funny, or you have the quiff, or you have the aging Elvis, and then add into that the karate kicks and the punches, and it starts to look a bit ridiculous, which is another one of his cultural destinies, isn't it? It's like it becomes comical. The older, sagging, kind of sequin wearing, overweight guy. It's an unfortunate. It's a tragedy, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think to a lot of fans that the fact that his voice was still there kind of prevented some of that comedy. But to people outside of that, particularly because he'd been so dynamic in the 50s, I think as well, when he did put on weight in the 70s, and you know he bummed a few notes, and he'd have a lyric sheet in front of him because he forgot the words and things. Then of course, you know, you can point out, well, this is kind of ironic that, you know, why are people so interested in this guy when actually when you look at him, you know, he's not really as great as he deserves to, at that point. But I think by the 70s, Elvis had become so iconic. It's hard, you know, not to measure him like that, because, you know, when in by about 73, 74, he was living on a street that was named after him. I mean, he was at that level. He'd done a microfilm of all his possessions because he knew that would be historic.
Yeah.
So he had that kind of iconic fame, and he kept that going for quite a while. But actually, when you look at it towards the end, you know, he's not, a lot of the places he's touring are not that big. He's actually doing the secondary markets and things. So that idea of the giant iconic Elvis is maybe, you know, has human frailty behind it.
Yeah, I mean, for much of his life, I guess it was a pretty nocturnal existence, which one of the reasons why you get the unhealthy lifestyle and you get the uppers and downers to kind of try and regulate that somewhat. I mean, his drug use is probably a large part of his decline, wasn't it? I mean, there's, to keep this in relation to martial arts, and this is one reason I think why my friend found it so amusing, because he was reading this book and then we were going online, he was going, look, and he was finding on his phone like images of films of Elvis turning up to teach a kempo or karate class. But he's obviously smashed out of his mind on drugs. Like, can't even find door handles. You know, he's like walking up, like, hey, got his sunglasses on, and he's reaching for a door handle and missing it. And this guy's going to go into that place and teach a seminar to a load of adoring students. I mean, this was a source of endless comedy and mirth.
Yeah, I think for a lot of non-fans that's funny, and for some fans it's a tragedy. You know that this guy is obviously in some ways a lost soul. That his life is declining, and yet people are kind of, because of the power of celebrity, people are, and the wealth and the fame that he's got, people are kind of propping that up through, and therefore it turns around to be the question of, well, who could help this guy, because he seems to be so strong-willed in this delusion of celebrity that nobody can quite reach him to kind of sort him out on that level, and the martial arts couldn't sort him out. I mean, and that's an interesting thing, that so on one level you could sort of frame Elvis as a kind of a hypocritical figure, but on another level you could see him as maybe a kind of a lost soul, or somebody who was struggling.
Well, I mean, I think his narrative is different to someone like Robert Downey Jr. I mean, Robert Downey Jr. got messed up really badly for a long period of time, and he turned to martial arts to save him. But I think Elvis picked up his martial arts training while in the military, right? And then just loved it. Just like he was in Germany or somewhere, and he just loved it. And he was so. There's a great quotation. I think it might be from Ed Parker, or that someone who introduced Presley to Ed Parker, and he kind of sent a letter to someone saying, "Check out this kid." He says it's like, it's not pretty, or he's not pretty, but he's really good, or he's really tough, or something like that. Like, so when you see these films of Elvis doing stuff, it looks sloppy, it looks clumsy, but he was just so tough and quite strong that, well, what more do you need in a martial art? You just like, punch me, it doesn't bother me. I'm going to punch you, you're going to go down because I'm so big and heavy and coordinated.
Yeah, have you seen Joe Rogan's clip on YouTube of him talking about Elvis? Because he kind of gets into all of that and kind of makes it into comedy. And
I haven't seen it.
To be honest, Joe Rogan's quite an interesting person to do that, because of course he was a sports commentator and a comedian, so you can understand why he would see it that way. Yeah. So the quote that you were talking about, Elvis got into the martial arts I reckon at the end of 58. Now, the problem with Elvis history is that there's a lot of different dates, there's a lot of different ideas, and you have to kind of sift through it all the time.
Yeah.
But it looks to me that he got in at the end of 58. He had a German instructor called Jürgen Seidel. Now, Seidel was influenced by Henri Play, who's a French martial artist. And so Elvis found out about him, went to see a demo. He was based about 20 miles down the road. One of his, I think he was working in a converted hotel about 20 miles down the road from Elvis. And then he had another studio which was even more local. So this is a guy on the doorstep. Elvis went with his mate Rex Mantfield, and they got into Shotokan karate through that route. Mm-hmm. And there's kind of backstory to that, because some people think that he may have seen a judo demo in Fort Hood. Mm-hmm. He may also have read What is Karate by Mas Oyama, mm-hmm. Who I believe was quite a sort of one of the people that kind of mixed up karate in the 50s with kind of like sort of popular marketing, and kind of got into the America, like did a tour of America and got into the American market. So maybe some of those influences were coming in, but certainly I've also read that he got into karate at the end of 1959, so a year later. Now, the reason I don't think that's true is that he got a brown belt early 1960, and I think it would have probably taken him more than a few weeks to get it, but I don't know.
Okay. So, I mean, so who has these different versions? I mean, because he didn't keep a diary or anything, did he? It's just like friends, testimonials, and
yeah.
Okay. And do you know what people were saying about his abilities at the time, or what fans have made of it? Because I know that you've done a lot of studies around fandom and the character of Elvis and so on.
Well, it didn't really get significantly drifted into his public image until early 1960, when he came back from the army and did a press conference in Memphis and sort of said to people, "This is what I do in my spare time." And I think after that, it kind of was more visible in his image. But even then, you had to be aware of it and pick up on clues about it. So going back to the quote about, oh, this guy's not just pretty, but he's also tough.
Yeah.
What I believe happened, and so to fill in this other part of the history, was that once Elvis got back to America, one day he was at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel, staying there while he was making a film, and there was a demo going on downstairs that was Ed Parker, and Red West saw the sign in the lobby, oh, karate demo. So Elvis went down and watched, and Parker was really wrapped up in his demo. His head, that was where his headspace was at. And at the end, he was like, oh, Elvis Presley's here. So they then had a big chat. And then Parker, supposedly, although I'm not entirely sure about this, sent Elvis off to Hank Slamansky. And Hammering Hank apparently taught him for several weeks, and then did the test where Elvis got his first black belt.
Mm.
And I think it was at that moment, like just after that, that Slamansky sent a message back to Parker, like, this guy's not just not pretty anymore, but he's tough, kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, did the way it was? When I was younger, like long before I'd given any thought to this, it was always presented as a little bit like a bit of a sham. Because he was so famous that he was given black belts.
Yes.
I mean, there was definitely press around that I read at some point in my life. But like, he was legit, wasn't he? I mean, did he get bad press at the time for having a black belt? Did people kind of question his authenticity or his skill?
I'm not even sure if many people knew about the first black belt too quickly, but certainly later on, the last black belt he got was actually from Parker, was 9th degree. Yeah. Now, it's unlikely that given that there are only 10 degrees and that very few individuals in the world get anywhere near there, it's unlikely that Elvis was worth 9th degree. And in fact, Parker gave it him as a birthday present. But it was a full 9th degree certificate, and some of the other people who trained with Elvis, I think it was Wayne Carman, were a bit upset about that because like no way does this guy deserve his 9th degree, and of course he didn't. And I think Elvis knew it because he gave the certificate to his girlfriend Ginger Alden. He kind of brushed it off because I think he wanted to feel that he'd earned them. However. Then there's the question of, well, okay, so given he probably did earn his first one, and at that point there were maybe I think Joe Corcoran said that there were about 100 martial artists in America, so Elvis was one amongst the pioneers. Like, at what point in going up through those different degrees did he then stop being a proper martial artist and become an inauthentic one? Well, I'm not qualified to say, and I don't know.
I mean, they say, I remember the first time I heard about this, long time ago, I used to do Taekwondo, and my instructor at the time was like a 4th degree black belt, and I think he got a 5th, they promoted him to 5th degree, and he said, really, your first 4 dans are for your ability, and everything after that is for what you've given back. So there's an argument, if we follow that line of thinking, that people are acknowledging what he'd given back to I mean, that's like stretching credibility to the furthest possible point. But I mean, did he give back? Did he teach, or was it just his public kind of profile?
He did do some teaching, but I don't, and certainly he was witnessing to the giving out of other different black belts and other things. But I don't think he signed off any black belts. So he was kind of second witness and stuff. But yeah, he did do some teaching and instruction, because he had a thing. I think what happened really was that so after Slamansky, he kind of trained with Parker, particularly in the early 70s, and then also with a guy called Kang Ree who did Taekwondo. And what happened was that once you got to a certain level, I think it was 7th or 8th degree, you could set up your own institute. So basically he did that. And then, so there was a thing called the Tennessee Karate Institute that he set up in 1974.
Mm.
And so then he had kind of his own organization and place to do karate. And also he wasn't, when he did it, he asked usually for there to be no press and no cameras around when he was training and teaching.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we don't have that many pictures of him, ironically, doing it. I mean, we have some when he did public demos and things.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, I mean, I've just been thinking about this, and it's ridiculous really, because the first time I've thought about it, but I've known about this structure for a long time. There are a couple of different routes by which martial arts reach Western consciousness. And one of them, the really important narrative, is American servicemen, American soldiers coming back from East Asia, or in this case, Western Europe, but still, and having experienced Japanese and Korean martial arts. So you have, Chuck Norris is the famous case. The other route, of course, is through the sort of the China, like San Francisco, Chinatowns, and so on, which is a different sort of trade route. But I mean, Elvis kind of typifies that process in which he does something which is Eastern. It's characterized as Eastern. He's a serviceman. He comes back to the USA, and then loves it and lives it, but transforms it into something else, like in Western consciousness, like karate and American Kempo and stuff. It becomes something else. On the one hand, mystical and Asian, but on the other hand, it's a bit more like, it becomes like Master Ken. It becomes a bit like a totally different thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it does, and from what I've kind of looked into in just in recent times, mainly, is that I remember seeing a podcast before where you were talking about the idea that karate maybe became more of a joke into the 80s and 90s, and it like there are moments where it's a kind of joke back in the 60s and 70s in terms of the public kind of portrayal, and one of those was when Ed Parker went on the Lucy show. So there you've got a kind of fully fledged martial artist doing his thing in the context of a comedy show where kind of jokes are going on around him. And then the other thing I thought of was High Karate Aftershave, which I traced back to 67. And I think and that's got a kind of Elvis connection, because of course the idea of High Karate is that you will be fending off women, which is what Elvis kind of constantly did. So
yeah. No, that's great. I mean, I've written a book. My next book is called The Invention of Martial Arts, and it'll be out hopefully in December. And I've spent a lot of time writing about the high karate thing, but I didn't make the connection explicitly between what Elvis was doing, because it is 1967 it first appears. But they made different high karate adverts in the States and compared to the ones in Britain, which we know. And they're very, very different. Like the humor is different. Like the version we have is kind of Benny Hill type version, but the American one is very much more monogamous and a kind of humor that I didn't really get. But I didn't make the Elvis connection. But you think there could be an Elvis connection there?
But just the idea that you would do karate to fend off women was kind of interesting. And in connection with that, I know that. One of the things that Parker did was when Elvis got death threats and things, Parker would be kind of brought in to kind of look after him for a while, and Parker stationed one of his students, Dave Hebler, to look after Elvis and become his bodyguard. And Dave Hebler's talked about using his karate skills to get in between Elvis and the fans, in order that if the fans were kind of coming up, he would take the blow and his body would take it, so that they wouldn't get any lawsuits or problems with injured fans. So it's kind of interesting in relation to that. But I don't know if there's any kind of direct connection. It's just interesting that kind of comedy version of karate was also associated with gender, with the kind of women's liberation. And the other thing that, as you were talking before, I thought about it in relation to was it's globalization, isn't it? I mean, that sort of 50s, 60s period is the moment where Americans can kind of fly off to different places, and all these different practices start melding together, and the East meets the West in all sorts of different ways, including those kind of Orientalist or kind of comedic ways.
Yeah, and I read somewhere there was I was looking at news stories. I was looking through the kind of, I was searching for keywords like martial arts, in the British national press, and the story comes up later on. I think it's in the maybe late 70s, maybe early 80s, and didn't Elvis's wife have an affair with his one of his instructors?
She
What do you
did.
know about that situation?
Yes, yeah, she did. I mean, that was basically how his marriage ended. Now, I'm not entirely sure because a lot of the dates are so hazy on this, whether the affair happened before they were separated or after they were separated. But okay, so what happened there was that Elvis, through Ed Parker, went to a karate tournament in '68 and saw it's Mike Stone you're talking about. Saw Mike Stone fighting there and thought he was a bit cocky, but they never actually met Mike Stone at that point. And then later on, Parker introduced Priscilla to Mike Stone, but I'm not sure whether that was before or after she'd also met him, because Priscilla trained with Ed Parker, she trained with Kangri, and she trained with Chuck Norris. And all of those guys said, oh, she's actually quite good at it because she's got this flow with ballet training and dancing that she can actually do these kicks and things quite with good precision. And it was through the training with Chuck Norris that she met Mike Stone. Now, whether she trained with Mike Stone first and then trained with Norris, or trained with Norris and then met Mike Stone, some of those facts are a little bit hazy, and we'd need to get her involved to kind of clarify them, or him. But yeah, that's what happened. And I think the interesting thing to me is that Elvis's response to that was to get more into karate, because the idea was maybe like this, what's this guy got that I haven't? Right. He's not got any money, so it must be this whole, martial arts champion thing. Well, maybe, if I train a bit more.
You could. I mean, when chaos happens in your life, you throw yourself into things. I mean, for me, exercise is one of my happy places. It's like maybe he was so into it that it was just a happy place for him. But he also used to try and lose weight, didn't he? Because he didn't do it through diet, because he had a shocking diet. But he would. This was his go-to, like, try to lose weight, try to be healthy activity, wasn't it?
I think it was for a certain period of his career. I think towards the end, racquetball and that kind of thing became more important to him. But certainly in the around 1973, 1974 in particular, he was on fire with karate. I mean, it was coming out in his stage performances. He was setting up this institute. And there was, and he was going to do a film called Gladiator. There was so much going on.
Did he? So 1973 is a big year for martial arts, isn't it? It's a big year for post-modernity. 1973 is a big year. It's also the year that Bruce Lee gets famous. Bruce Lee dies. Did Bruce Lee come onto his radar at all? I mean, if you knew Chuck Norris and he was working in those kind of circles.
Yeah, I don't. I've not read that he ever met him. And from the things that I think, there's one thing out online saying that he asked to meet him a couple of times, but I've not been able to verify that. Now, I don't know why, because given Bruce Lee's fame, given his acuity in the martial arts, you would think Elvis would be, and given probably how near Elvis lived to Bruce Lee for a certain period of time, you would think that Elvis would be quite interested in.
And I would have thought Bruce Lee would have loved something like that, because it would have been such a door-opening moment for him to meet someone.
Yeah, and they both knew Parker, right? Parker was a mutual connection. So the only thing I can think of, and I don't know, and this is complete speculation, was that I believe, and you probably know more about this, Lee was a suspect in the Manson murders for a while. Is that bunk, or is that kind of?
Do you know what? I don't know about that.
Right? Yeah, yeah.
That's
We'll draw a veil over that one, but like, I mean, if given that Elvis was kind of in with people like the local police, he might have kind of got wind of that and thought, oh. But I don't know. I mean, that's complete
I
speculation.
think we'd need to ask Quentin Tarantino about that, wouldn't we? We'd need to get some clarity on
Yes, yeah, yeah, indeed.
on what exactly happened that night. Yeah, okay. So what do we? I mean, let's ask a little bit about your research. So tell me about the. I'm guessing that the starting point of your interest in Elvis was you just loved his music and you just thought he was cool. I mean, is that this origin story? But tell me about your academic, what you've done in your studies and your research around Elvis.
Well, no, it didn't really start like that. The way it started was that my first degree was in geography a long time ago at Oxford University. And then from there, I went international and studied geography in different departments in Vancouver in Canada, and then in Wales, actually, in Aberystwyth. And as I was going through that postgraduate journey, I kind of moved across from geography to popular music because I was more interested in popular music. And so when I did my PhD, I wanted to look at the relationship between artists and their fans. And I thought, well, who can I study? Oh, I'll study Elvis. He's got a really massive, loyal and prominent following. I'm sure there'll be a lot to learn. And there was. I mean, I think at the time I was a little bit naive as to the baggage that Elvis had in terms of the previous things we were kind of talking about in the 70s and the kind of the hypocrisy kind of comedy kind of stuff. But I really got into it and I met a lot of Elvis fans through it and enjoyed doing it. And that kind of set me on my path in my academic life for the last 20, 25 years looking at all of this. So really, my discipline, if I have one, is kind of popular music studies, but then I've had a welcome in fan studies. So I'm kind of a fan studies has kind of become an exploding area. And sort of my work's ended up a bit there and in popular music studies, and there is some difference between the two areas, but there's also a lot of overlap. So yeah, I mean, in that period, I've sometimes written on Elvis, I've sometimes written on music fandom in other ways, and I've occasionally looked at other artists. Yeah.
And you've done a couple of books, edited collections, and
yeah.
So
it's always a bit embarrassing when people wave their books.
So you've got there's Counting Down Elvis, his 100, was it 100?
Yeah, finest
songs. Okay, yeah.
So and that one's just a song countdown.
Yeah, and what's the other one? Is Elvis Roots Image Comeback Phenomenon by Mark Duffett. This is your newest one, isn't it?
It is, yeah. So this one actually had a 10-year genesis, actually, because I was asked to do it that long ago. And then I handed it in 18 months late. And then the editor sat on it for 4 years and then died. And then we kind of got back together with the publisher, brushed it up, rewrote it a bit, and it's just come out. Yeah.
So it's just come out with which publisher?
That's Equinox Press, not a very famous one, but the series is quite famous. It's called Icons of Popular Music, and they do different stuff.
And you've got another thing in the pipeline with Oxford University Press, is that right?
Yes, that's called Rethinking Elvis. I did a conference in Memphis in 2017 with different scholars from all over the world, and they were looking at Elvis stuff. So we got together a book on that. Yeah.
Excellent. And is that coming out this year or next?
Probably next year. Yeah, we're still working on it. Might need 1 or 2 more contributors at this rate. So we'll have to see how it goes. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, you'll have to. My book will be out before yours. Then you'll have to look at my section on high karate, and
I'll be looking forward to that. Yeah. Who does it come out with? Who's your publisher?
Well, it's Oxford University Press.
Oh, okay. Excellent. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because so that whole period is so fascinating. The 60s, 70s.
Yeah, I think so. I think it really is. I mean, between about 1967 and 1973, like the world changed, the popular cultural environment changed, and one of the major things, from my perspective, that happened was obviously the invention of the notion of martial arts, and Elvis was kind of there. I haven't really I've talked about Elvis in the book, but I didn't really pull him out to foreground his work because that, you know, it would have been an enormous book. I've tried to document the kind of popular cultural history that would be seen on most international screens. So it's like everything from cartoons like Hong Kong Phooey, and, you know, it really starts with the Avengers in the 60s. You know, not the Marvel Comics thing, the British spy drama, huge impact on what people thought fighting was and the coolness in the foreign. But yeah, the late 60s and the first half of the 70s, it just explodes, doesn't it?
Explodes, doesn't it? Yeah, absolutely. And all of those like Way of the Dragon, Enter the Dragon, Black Belt Jones, and all those ones. Yeah. And then Elvis was watching a bunch of those, right, and kind of studying the moves and things. We know that.
Well, everyone was.
Yeah, everyone was. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. How did that? What was the relationship between that and the sport, if you like, or the kind of the pure martial arts, if you can talk about that?
I think my argument is that although the term martial arts existed, and it always has existed as a translation of the Japanese term like buge, you know, it just means it's the concept martial arts doesn't really come into existence. And I think one of the first, possibly the first use of the term in the English language in a martial arts context is Bruce Lee saying, "And every day I practice martial arts." And in specialist text, you get the term martial arts does occur, but as a literal translation of the Japanese. And you don't have the entity of the martial artist until really the very, very early 70s. Like, people did judo, or they did jujitsu, or they might have done tang sudo or something, like kung fu or something, but they weren't a martial artist, not in the West, not in the English. They did something, but there wasn't that overarching popular cultural paradigm. It just didn't exist.
Yeah, that's interesting to me, because that one of the things that I mean, I'm sure you have an argument about why that is, but my guess is part of why it is because a lot of the martial artists from those traditions started combining, and then they were kind of combining almost entrepreneurially and kind of seemingly without some kind of regard for the histories of those, but I'm sure they did have regard, but there was a sort of a combinatory kind of ethos. And I think Elvis was the same in music, that he was combining genres, right? He was kind of like, let's have a bit of gospel and a bit of funk or blues or whatever. So I think there seems to be that, and I think that's, there's the marketing and the doing go hand in hand during that period as well. There's a sort of an entrepreneurial culture of all these people kind of forming their systems. Yeah.
I mean, you've got to think about the work of something like a movie poster. So the movie poster for Enter the Dragon, it famously says the first American produced martial arts spectacular. Now that's very likely to be the first time that, I mean, more people saw that poster than saw the film. It's very likely to be the most prominent early usage of the term martial arts in America and in the West and so on. But I mean, this always happens, you know, like when the UFC started in 1993, they weren't calling it mixed martial arts. My former PhD student, Kyle Barrowman, he looked at the history of this and the commentaries, and they start to use the term mixed martial arts because it's got a cool MMA. It's like they like these three words, these three letter acronyms. Right. And so people were doing something that wasn't MMA. Like, you can look at it and go, yeah, of course it's MMA. They've been doing it forever. And you can go back and say Bruce Lee did it and the Japanese did it. But the concept MMA didn't exist until it's like retroactive. And then we project that back. And the same happened with martial arts, really. You project it. The term existed, of course, but it wasn't like a popular cultural entity. It wasn't a discursive entity that people could say, I am a martial artist. You couldn't identify as that category because it really wasn't there or wasn't functioning in that mainstream way.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, there's a great book. It's probably on my shelf somewhere. Oh, there it is. You might be interested in this book, Rebels, by Leron Medvoy, Youth Culture and the Cold War Origins of Identity, because in that one, he argues that that the individuals that came up during the Cold War period, we talked about James Dean and Elvis and other people, seemed to exemplify individuality, and his argument is that that was useful in the context of American kind of colonialism, because you couldn't just invade countries and build your empire like that at that stage. What you had to do was encourage those countries to be free from kind of authoritarian or communist or religious fundamentalist regimes. And so the idea of the kind of like individualist person was kind of a metaphor or a microcosm of how America wanted these countries to be. Now, I don't know whether that's true or not, but that the idea of individual expression seemed to be really important during that phase of history.
Yeah. And people thought it was, maybe they felt it was subversive, but it wasn't necessarily subversive of the Western culture in which it emerged. It was potentially subversive as a kind of foreign policy. Maybe.
Yes, yeah.
Well, we've drifted from Elvis, and time's marching on, and I just want to say that it's been really, really great to talk to you about Elvis, and yeah, really thought-provoking and really great, and really nice to meet you, albeit virtually. So thank you, Mark.
Yes, likewise, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to do this. It's been interesting.
Thanks.